Hey, can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Answer my question, because I don't know. Because if you can't hear me, I got to cancel the podcast. There will be no live reading if you cannot hear me. Oh, sweet. You guys can hear me. Perfect. All right. Thank Christ. Anyways, because the ping on my desktop is really bad and it has a propensity to drop every couple of minutes, I've been having issues with live streaming, and I've been having other problems as well lately. So, because of technical difficulties, I'm currently outside in the woods, surrounded by mosquitoes. So, I'm going to be pacing around a bit, waving my book around. But, anyways, we're out in the great outdoors. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. What we have here is History is Mystery by Michael Parenti. I'm not that far into this book, but it's already a favorite of mine. And because I've already picked up a lot from this book, I want to share that information with you guys. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and skip the prologue and go straight to chapter one. Chapter one: History as Miseducation. The term history refers both to past happenings and to the study of them, both the experiencing of a social process and the recording of it. However, the distinction is not an absolute one, for those who write history help influence the course of events by shaping our understanding of things past and present. Conversely, those who actively participate in a historical event, especially if they occupy elite policy positions, often manipulate the materials needed for documenting that event. In addition, there are some individuals who both make history and write it. Mainstream orthodoxy. Among those involved in the manufacturing history are political leaders, military commanders, journalists, television producers, government and corporate scribes, clergy, amateur investigators, textbook editors, school teachers, retooled fiction writers, and academics. An individual can be both a historian and an active participant in historic events. In antiquity, among those who engaged in events and recorded them were Polybius, Cicero, Caesar, Sallust, and Dio Cassius. Polybius believed that experience in public affairs was an essential qualification for the historian. Until that day comes where there will be no respite from the errors that historians will commit, unquote. Even if we agree with him that political experience is a necessary qualification, it is hardly a sufficient guarantee against error, and it often invites distortions of its own. In the first century AD, Josephus wrote his history of the Jewish uprising against Rome after playing a prominent political and military role in that struggle. And centuries before, there was Thucydides, Thucydides, uh, Thucydides, a military leader who wrote a monumental history of the very Peloponnesian War in which he had participated. The 19th century gave us Guziot, Malachy, Mommsen, Ratek, and Thiers. It was Thiers who presided over the bloody suppression and mass executions of thousands of revolutionary partisan communards. To any list of historian come political office holders, or political office holders come historians, we could add Gibbon, Tocqueville, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, populist leader Tom Watson, and French socialist leader Jean Jaurès, who took the time to write a history of the French Revolution. Later on, there were anti fascist scholar politicians like Hermann Rauschning and Gaetano Salvemini. In our day, alas, we must make do with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Henry Kissinger, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Winston Churchill was supposed to have assured his Tory associates, quote, "History will be kind to us, gentlemen, for I plan to write it," unquote, with a concern that history be kind to them and the additional inducements of munitions advances from their publishers, political leaders regularly produce self-serving memoirs whose contributions to historical truth are often parsimonious. Perhaps the premier example of the politician historian is Churchill himself. Gordon Lewis sees Churchill as someone who could never quite make up his mind whether he was a historian writing about politics or a politician writing about history. My understanding of Churchill is that he strongly preferred vita activa to vita quieta. He was above all a political animal whose historiography served to justify his leadership and his worldview. How his history supported his politics, and more generally, British ruling class ideology, would itself be subject of interesting study. Clive Ponting relates how impressed he was by Churchill's study of World War II with its wonderful language and dramatic narrative. But years later, reading through war documents in the Public Record Office, he realized that much of the account has been oversimplified or omitted, and that Churchill's history, quote, "despite all its virtues, is a politician's memoir designed to relate his version of events and to present the story as he wanted," unquote. Churchill played his Churchill portrayed his country as a lonely citadel of freedom, valiantly holding out against Hitler, determined to fight to the bitter end on the beaches and in the towns, without citing the heroic dedication of the many Britons who sacrificed so much to help defeat Nazism. We should note that as early as 1940, Great Britain was financially depleted with few military or industrial assets at land, yet expending much of its scarce and precious resources to keep the restive peoples of its vast empire forcibly subjugated. For the Tory government, maintaining the empire was at least as great as an imperative as defeating the Nazis. British leaders seriously considered coming to peace terms with Berlin so they might make common sense. British leaders seriously considered coming to peace terms with Berlin so that they might make common cause with the Nazis against the real bête noire, Russian Bolshevism. Most members of the British ruling class did not merely seek to appease Hitler, but admired him and his anti-Soviet crusade. While ostensibly at war with Germany, Britain's Tory leaders sought passage of Allied forces through Scandinavia and Finland in order to launch an attack against the Soviet Union, an action Churchill supported even after the Finns had signed a peace treaty with Moscow in March 1940, and at a time when the Nazis were overrunning Europe. All this fits poorly with the image of a British government single-mindedly dedicated to resisting Nazism at all costs. As with most British and American accounts of the war, Churchill's history ignores the major role played by the Soviet Union in Nazism's defeat and the horrendous losses of life and property sustained by the Soviets fighting on a scale that was many times greater than anything on the Western Front. Much of the distortion within mainstream history is neither willful nor conscious, one may presume, since it is an outgrowth of the overall political ideology and culture. If there was no conscious intent to miseducate, it is because many historians who claim to be disciples of impartial scholarship have little sense of how they are wedded to ideological respectability and inhospitable to counter-hegemonic views. This synchronicity between their individual beliefs and the dominant belief system is treated as objectivity. Departures from this ideological orthodoxy themselves are dismissed as ideological. Let me add that much of the distortion is willful, perpetrated by those who are constantly dedicated to burying the past or shaping our understanding of it to suit their interests. In a moment of candor, Churchill himself told William Deakin, who had helped him write the Second World War, quote, "This is not history, this is my case," unquote. Few mainstream historians seem willing to reflect upon how the power structure of their society influences their discipline. Many, income, Many, including some who claim to be on the left, are discomforted by such Marxist-sounding terms as ruling class history. They consider the label undeserved because history is written by professionally trained academics and other independent investigators who are not members of the ruling class. But such history can still be heavily influenced by ruling ideology. Nor do you have to be a member of the ruling class to serve its interests. That a religious belief is propagated by its lower clergy and ordinary adherents does not make it any less the hierarchy's dictum. Indeed, such a lower echelon transmission is an essential factor in maintaining the belief's hegemony. It is also argued that there is no ruling class because there is no ruling class in a pluralistic democratic country like the United States. In fact, it is a matter of public record that a tiny portion of the population controls the lion's share of the wealth and most of the command positions of the state: manufacturing, banking, investment, publishing, higher education, philanthropy, and media. And while not totally immune to popular pressures, these individuals exercise a predominant influence over what is passed off as public information and democratic discourse. The ruling class is the politically active component of the owning class. The top captains of finance and policy who set the standards for investing and concentration of capital at home and abroad. They play a dominant role in determining the wage scales and working conditions of millions. They strip away employees' benefits and downsize whole workforces while warring tirelessly against organized labor. They set rates of interest and they control the money supply, including the national currency itself. They enjoy oligarchic control of the principal technologies of industrial production and mass communication. They and their adjuncts populate the boards of directors, or trustees or regents, of corporations, universities, and foundations. They repeatedly commit serious corporate crimes but almost never go to prison. They raid the public treasury for corporate welfare subsidies, for risk capital, bailout capital, export capital, research and development capital, promotional capital, and equity capital. They plunder the public domain, dominating the airwaves, destroying ancient forests, polluting lands and waters with industrial effluents, depleting the ozone layer, and putting the planet's entire ecology at risk for the sake of a quick profits. At home and abroad, they are faithfully served by the national security state with all its covert and repressive apparatuses. Their faithful acolytes occupy the more powerful security agency positions and cabinet posts, regardless of what party or personality controls the White House. They create international agreements like NAFTA and GATT that circumvent the democratic protections of sovereign states and undermine the ability of popular governments to develop public sector services. Public sector services for anyone other than these powerful interests. Their overall economic domination and their campaign contributions, media monopoly, high paid lobbyists, and public relation experts regularly predetermine who will be treated as major political candidates and which party parameters will prevail. These ruling elites are neither omnipotent nor infallible. They suffer confusions and setbacks and have differences among themselves. They sometimes grope for ways to secure and advance their interests in the face of changing circumstances, learning by trial and error. Through all this, their capital accumulation continues unabated. Though relatively few in number, they get the most of what there is to get. Their wealth serves their power, and their power serves their wealth. The hunt for real democracy. The most comprehensive federal survey released by the U.S. Department of Education finds that nearly 6 in 10 high school seniors lack even a rudimentary knowledge of American history. A survey conducted by the Gallup organization shows that 25% of college seniors, cannot come up with a half century of locating the dates of Columbus's voyage. About 40% 8% describe the differences between World War I and World War II, though they suspect that World War II came after World War I. Another Gallup poll finds that 60% of Americans are unable to name the president who ordered the atomic bomb to be dropped on Japan, and 22% have no idea that such an attack even occurred. A 1995 survey in the New York Times reports that only 49% of US adults knew that the Soviet Union had been an ally of the United States during the World War, with the rest either having no opinion or thinking that the Soviets were non-combatants or on the enemy's side. The picture is no better in regard to current affairs. A survey by the National Assessment of Educational Programs reveals that 47% of the nation's high school juniors do not know that each state has 2 U.S. senators. A 1998 survey reports that nearly 95% of U.S. teenagers can name the lead actor in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, a television show, but less than 2% know the name of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Ain't that sad? And while only 41% of teenagers can name the 3 branches of government, 59% can name the Three Stooges, demonstrating once again that television is a more commanding teacher than school. Almost all of these surveys focus on U.S. history. Were questions asked about the history of other nations in pre-U.S. epochs, the figures would be even more dismal. This historical and political literacy should come as no surprise. Most states require not more than a year of history in high school, and some states, like Alaska, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, require no history of any kind. According to the National Center for Education Standards, as of 1994, fewer than 19% of high school and middle school social studies teachers had majored or minored in history. But something else is operating besides mass ignorance and the mass media. The important question is, what is so desirable about knowledge most of these facts in the first place, especially if they remain unconnected to any meaningful socio-historic explanation and often mask more than they reveal? To be sure, we cannot grasp the significance of an event or epoch if we do not even know it existed. But if all we know are a few bare facts, we comprehend little of importance. Contrary to the popular adage, it is seldom the case that the facts speak for themselves. While factual data are a prerequisite for understanding social realities, we must find ways of making sense of them, of appreciating their imports and showing their relevance to larger developments. As Lord Acton put it, quote, history exhibits truths as well. Hold on, lost my place. Quote, history exhibits truth as well as facts, when the facts are seen not merely as they follow, but as they correspond, not merely as they have appeared, but as they have paralleled, unquote. Instead of just wishing more students knew that the Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823 and it was attempted to discourage European colonization in the Western Hemisphere, we might want to ask why U.S. leaders felt compelled to introduce this doctrine. Was it an altruistic gesture to protect Latin countries from European despotism, as some claims at the time, and many textbooks have maintained ever since? Was it to assure the peace and safety of the United States, as the doctrine itself declares? Or could a major consideration have been to guarantee a free hand for U.S. investors in the Western Hemisphere? Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, a principal sharper of the Monroe Doctrine, understood that even the British were aware that, quote, the new Spanish-American market simply had to be kept open for U.S. commercial interests and free from the colonization by the continental powers. Such considerations could lead to others. Does U.S. foreign policy, as embodied in the Declaration, such as the Monroe Doctrine, represent the interests of the American people? How so, or why not? Why would U.S. policy be so considerate of investor interests abroad? Why do U.S. corporate interests pursue overseas investments in the first place? What effects do these investments have on the people who inhabit these other lands and on our own people at home? Historical parallels could be entertained. Thus, how does the Monroe Doctrine compare to the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, or the Nixon Doctrine, the Carter Doctrine, and other assertions of U.S. primacy in various regions of the world? Why do so many US presidents feel compelled to promulgate such doctrines? Is there a common pattern behind these various proclamations? By linking the Monroe Doctrine to a broader set of questions about past and present events, we make it more relevant and more interesting topic of study. The important thing is not just to identify specific historical events, as might a quiz show contestants, but to think intelligently and critically about them, to be able to relate them to broader social relations. If people know little about standard history, they know even less about the silenced, hidden parts of history. More meaningful than remembering the date of Columbus' voyage is knowing about the cold-blooded slaughter and plunder he perpetuated against Native Americans, a homicidal rapacity that has been reenacted and surpassed by those who came after him, many whose crimes are also whitewashed in mainstream narratives. Other underplayed parts of North American history would include the early agrarian rebellions, the industrial class struggle of the last 2 centuries, the suppression of radical political dissents, the private plunder and spoliation of the public resources, the bloody expansionism inflicted on indigenous peoples in North America and throughout the world, US global expansionism, and US sponsored atrocities against revolutionaries and reformers throughout the Third World. Despite the miseducation, fuck off, B. Despite the miseducation they might have endured, or because of it, many people are hungry for real history. Far from being bored, they start paying attention when history offers an analysis that advances their understanding of events. Fuck off, B. Anyways, they enjoy history when it is written in an accessible way, but not necessarily in facile, light-handed manner. When it presents interesting narratives and provocative observations that relates to broader questions of social conflict and developments. When it offers revealing parallels to what is going on now, suggesting that current events are not merely the result of particular personalities and passing phenomenon, but have compelling analogies in times long past. Real history is interesting also when it deconstructs the pop we learned in school or from social media, when it demonstrates how we have been misled. More exciting than learning history is unlearning the disinformational history we have been taught. Real history goes the extra step and challenges existing icons, offering interpretations that have a healthy subverting effect on mainstream ideology. Attempts at real history are dismissed by conservatives as revisionism. To use revisionism as an epithet is to say that there is no room for historical reinterpretation, that the standard version of objective and factual, and that many departure from it can only be ideological and faddish. Revisionism's real sin is that it challenges many time-honored bourgeois beliefs about the world, including the happy-faced image of America's beautiful, the image, quote, to which most Americans, particularly those raised in conscious history textbooks, have become accustomed. Revisionism also opens up a new area of inquiry. It is remarkable the things that most of us never learn in school or about our own history. The topics and inquiries we are never introduced to. Consider this incompatible listing. Quote, why were human beings held in slavery through a good part of U.S. history? Why were they not given any lands till after their emancipation? Why were Native American Indians systematically massacred time and time again? Question. What is the property of American civilization? What is wealth? How have large concentrations of capital been accumulated? Is there a causal relationship between wealth for the few and poverty for the many? What role has government played in the formation of great fortunes and giant corporations? What effects has this had on the democratic process? Why in past generations did people work 12 hours a day? Or longer, 6 and even 7 days a week? Where did the weekend and the 8-hour day come from? Why were labor unions considered unconstitutional through much of the 19th century and into the early 20th century? Who were the Wobblies, the Knights of Labor, the Populists, and the Progressives? Why did tens of thousands of Americans consider themselves anarchists, socialists, or communists? Why did hundreds of thousands vote for radical candidates? How did poor children get to go to public schools? How did communities get public libraries? What role has social class played in education and in American life in general? How did we get laws on behalf of the occupational safety, minimum wage, environmental protections, retirements, and disability benefits? How effective have they been? Who still opposes them and why? What historic role has corporate America played in advancing or retarding the conditions of workers, women, African Americans, Native Americans, and various other ethnic groups? Why are most corporate decisions regarding investments, jobs, and use of resources and markets considered to be private? Why have U.S. military forces intervened directly or indirectly in so many countries over the last century? Why has U.S. leaders opposed revolutionary and even reformist governments and supported right-wing autocracies around the world? Questions of this sort are seldom asked in our media, schools, or textbooks. Textbooks, America the Beautiful. In failing to teach about class conflict and class domination, mainstream history shows itself to be an extension of that domination in cultural form. This can be seen in the history packaged for classroom use. The history textbook is a crucial instrument for advancing our miseducation. Among elementary and secondary school students, most classroom time and almost all homework is time spent with textbook materials. People complain that history that they encountered in school was just a mind numbing compilation of a lot of names, dates, and facts. But is that really the problem? After all, names, dates, and facts can be intriguing and eye opening depending on what is being considered. In any case, history textbooks offer much more than that. Current editions are filled with stories, character profiles, vignettes, anecdotes, and colorful graphics and illustrations. Why then are they, and much of the rest of mainstream history, so unsatisfying? Why did a Harris poll find that high school students ranked history as the most irrelevant of the 21 subjects? It was Catherine Morland who thought it odd that history, quote, should be so dull since a great deal of it must be invention. In fact, such inventions itself may contribute to the dullness. In a well received critique of U.S. history textbooks, James Lowen notes how the books tell predictably constructed stories and, quote, exclude conflicts and real suspense. Every problem has already been solved or is about to be solved. While textbooks sometimes try for drama, they achieve only melodrama because readers only know that everything will turn out fine in the end. As one textbook put it, despite setbacks, the United States overcame these challenges. Furthermore, most textbook authors write in a tone that, if heard aloud, might be described as a bumbling lecture. No wonder the students lose interest. Tyson Bernstein makes a similar point. While there are some good textbooks on the market, most, quote, confuse students with non sequiturs, mislead them with misinformation, and profoundly bore them with pointless, arid writing. The lack of drama, a mumbling style, and arid writing are not the only problems with textbooks. Boredom is bad enough, but miseducation is worse. It is the dilution of the flattening of contents that turns fascinating history into tedious pabulum. Rather than being dense compendiums of facts and dates, textbooks often suffer from a shallow comprehensiveness, the superficiality that comes when attempting to cover too much too meekly. Textbooks and many other mainstream history books also suffer from a lack of critical perspective and a need to avoid any scrapes. Sorry, I'm just checking, make sure I'm still streaming. Uh, and many other mainstream history books also suffer from a lack of critical perspective and a need to avoid any scrapes with the U.S. capitalist belief system. Lowen notes that textbooks leave out anything that might reflect badly upon national character. In addition, they leave out anything that might reflect badly on the world's dominant political economic power circles. There's scant mention of the endless succession of injustices and atrocities perpetrated by potentates, patriarchs, princes, popes, prime ministers, presidents, and plutocrats. Instead, they offer what Christopher Hitchens calls, quote, a story to uplift or a chronicle of obstacles overcome. On most subjects, textbooks dilute controversy, preferring to be ideologically safe, offering a highly processed product that contains little flavor and new nutrients. More than just a stylistic problem, this is an informational and ideological bias reflective of the larger power arrangements within society. Not just textbooks, but much of mainstream history offers only passing murmurs about the great labor struggles of the last 2 centuries. In History of the American People, a 1,122-page tome to be seriously avoided, Samuel Eliot Morison touches only lightly on labor struggles, with not a word about popular champions such as John Swinton, Charles Steinmetz, Albert Parsons, Jacob Coxey, Webb Dubois, Big Bill Haywood, Clarence Darrow, Mother Jones, Zoe Hill, William Z. Foster, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and Emma Goldman. Morison offers a representative example of the kind of U.S. history that would not cause a moment's discomfort to persons of influence and fortune. Nor was it much different in earlier times, as Ruth Miller Ellison found in her study of some 100,000 history, geography, and civics textbooks used during the 19th century. In no book published before 1870 are labor combinations mentioned. In later decades, the school books are virtually unanimous regarding the evil effects of labor unions. Strike, riot, and labor disturbances are often used interchangeably. Strikers include the idles and vicious, the dangerous classes, restless agitators, and foreigners. Property destruction is always carefully detailed, while grievances of the workmen are not. Not only is labor identified with violence, but it's only the context in which the organization of labor appears. Ellison's 19th century authors consider property to be symptomatic of indolence and vice and other degenerate morals. Since America is the land of opportunity, the indigents have only themselves to blame. Wealth is accumulated through diligent work and good character, and as one puts it, riches are the baggage of fortune, a sign of God's approval, never the result of having good fortune and being born into a good fortune. No mention is made of the often unsavory ways that riches have been accumulated by plundering public resources, pilfering the public treasury, violating public safety and antitrust laws, engaging force and violence to maintain exploitative labor relations. The business tycoons of that day are hailed as late American heroes. In fact, none of them were heroes, and many were not even American. The Vanderbilts were Dutch, the first DuPont was French, Carnegie was a native Scot, the first Guggenheim was a Swiss Jew, and the first Astor was a German-born. Anarchism, communism, and socialism, Elson observes, are repeatedly linked to subversion and violence. The books make much of how Americans are blessed with liberty, but a kind not intended for labor leaders and radicals. Nothing is said about how the moneyed classes bitterly opposed extending the vote and other basic democratic rights to the propertyless working people. The American Revolution is lauded for bringing about the birth of the great nation, but all the rebellions that followed, writes Elson, are always the work of unscrupulous agitators arbitrarily fomenting trouble. While all the books agree that Shays' rebellion demonstrated the need for a stronger national government, none mention that it revealed a need for helping the tax-ridden, debt-ridden farmers of Massachusetts whose desperate straits drove them to take up arms. The Whiskey Rebellion is treated in a similar fashion, being termed a, quote, criminal resistance in one book. In some, the nation's history is viewed from the top down to be deeply revered and not critically examined. A study by Francis Fitzgerald of the 19th and 20th century history textbooks found that few of them admits the existence of economic or political inequality. Many of them boost, quote, the American way of life and the glories of free enterprise, though never using the word capitalism and never explaining how the American economy actually works, with only one or two exceptions. Class conflict remains an inadmissible subject, as does economic history in general. American history texts are remarkable for their lack of economic analysis. Instead of conflict between interests of social classes, the textbooks refer to problems. There were problems during Reconstruction, also problems of poverty, pollution, and racial unrest, all of unstated origin. Equally mysterious problems arise around the globe, for which we are taking up our responsibilities, exercising world leadership for the benefit of all peoples, noted Fitzgerald. The texts of the 1950s make estimates about Soviet power and the threat of world communism that are far more fearsome than anything written in the earlier wartime texts about Nazi aggression and the threat of World War II. The textbooks have titles like Free and the Brave, the story of American people. Excuse me, I'm getting very hot right now. Ugh. Sorry, guys. Getting a little toasty here. I'm gonna rock a little turban. Anyways, man, the sun is powerful. How much longer do we got? Oh, yeah, we got hell time. All right. Fitzgerald detects a number of facelifts in the textbooks published in the early 70s. In the wake of social activism of the 1960s, portraits of Dolly Madison are replaced with photographs of Susan B. Anthony. The ubiquitous George Washington Carver gives way to Booker T. Washington and even Webb Du Bois. Mention is made of Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Nat Turner, and Cesar Chavez, though little actual history is provided. The 70s texts offer not a profound recasting, but mostly a tacking on of fragmentary information about some protests and protest leaders. Thus, the books may note that Thomas Paine's Common Sense was an influential pamphlet, but they do not dismiss what it says. In the 70s texts, the Chicano farm workers are struggling, but no hint is given about what they are struggling against, namely the economic power of agribusiness. Native Americans also struggle in a void, with no word about the historic collusion between big corporations and the Bureau of Indian Affairs in expropriating the lucrative natural resources of, fuck, I lost my track again. Natural resources of tribal lands. Sorry, guys. And racism is treated as an attitudinal problem, having no link to institutional or class interests. The principles that lies behind textbook history, concludes Fitzgerald, is the inclusion of nasty information constitutes bias even if the information is true. The Council on Interracial Books for Children studied 13 widely used U.S. history texts published in the 70s and found them to be an impoverishment and improvements over earlier ones that had presented a picture of our society that virtually all white and all male. But the newer ones remain seriously deficient and inaccurate in the treatments of ethnic peoples and women. In regard to African American history, for instance, the books ignore the enormous wealth that was accumulated from unpaid slave labor and was the prime impetus behind slavery. B. Minimize the brutality of the chattel system and the extent of slave resistance. C. Made no mention that for 78 years the Constitution contained protective provisions for the slaveholding class. D. Described the Reconstruction governments as corrupt and incompetent. E. The text also failed to recognize that the lack of land reform was a major factor in the continued economic oppression of former slaves, who proved to be efficient farmers on the relatively rare occasions that they were given land. Instead, the texts portray the former slaves as helpless, unable to live without the guidance of their former masters. Textbooks generally have little to say about the violent rapacity that ushered in the capitalist system. There is no mystification more fundamental to capitalism than the silence maintained about its own origins. A social order divided into boss and worker, landlord and farm laborer, is treated as the natural order. Never is it asked how the peasants were dispossessed of their land, artisans of their tools, and cottagers of their plots and gardens. It was a primitive accumulation achieved with swords, guns, hangmen, and prison. In the face of such silence, Marx felt compelled to write his own history of what he called the secret of primitive accumulation, the massive and coercive theft of the common lands and small holdings by big landowners. Primitive accumulation, as Michael Ignatieff points out, was not a Marxist invention, but a historic reality. its dynamic of, quote, enclosure, eviction, and expropriation was being experienced for 2 generations before Marx's works ever appeared. For Business Against Labor. A study by Jean Agnon of the 17th High School U.S. history texts, widely used in the late 1970s, covering the period from the Civil War to World War I, finds that the books present a consistently pro-business, anti-labor slant, covering many of the same persons and events with much of the same vocabulary and strikingly similar judgments. All 17 devote substantial space to the presumed benefits of industrial developments for the general public, while ignoring and glossing over the staggering human costs inflicted upon millions of working men, women, and children. Low wages are attributed to the willingness of unskilled immigrants to work for subsistence pay rather than to the own determination of owners' determination to impose power. Sorry about this, guys. All right. I'm just going to restart. All 17 devote substantial space to the presumed benefits of industrial developments for the general public, while ignoring or glossing over the staggering human costs inflicted upon millions of working men, women, and children. Low wages are attributed to the willingness of unskilled immigrants to work for subsistence pay rather than to the owner's determination to impose poverty-level pay scales. 12 of the books in Agnon's sample take no notice of the Socialist Party of America or its platform, nor the existence of any other radical organization. 4 of the 5 remaining texts disparage the intentions of the socialists and assert that they had only a small number of adherents. In fact, during the early 20th century, 1,200 socialists were elected to office in the U.S. cities, including 79 mayors in 24 states. In 1912, socialist labor leader Eugene Victor Debs received nearly 900,000 votes for president. In a contest that saw Woodrow Wilson elected with a plurality of only 6,293,152 votes. Runner-up Theodore Roosevelt received 4,119,207, and William Howard Taft 3,486,333. These figures suggested that, while Debs was a minority candidate in popular votes, as were all 3 of his opponents, he was more than an insignificant contender. Not surprisingly, mainstream history textbooks, if they mention Debs at all, have little to say about his leadership of railway employees, his valiant confrontation against the plutocracy, his belief in socialism and international worker solidarity, and his years in jail for his opposition to the First World War. Radical historians have pointed out that almost all financiers and industrialists of the late 19th century launched themselves in business either with inherent wealth or access to large loans and corrupt deals, or by profiteering during the Civil War, or in other ways acquiring land and land from the government. The textbook Agnon studied either avoids the subject or presents a historically false view of how wealth was accumulated, crediting a financial mogul like Andrew Carnegie with having started on a weekly wage of only $1.20, from which he supposedly saved enough to invest to make a fortune. In fact, Carnegie earned that meager sum when he was 13 and saved not a penny of it. Over the years, benefiting from a network of fellow immigrant Scots, he procured a job as a telegraph operator, then a manager and a railroad superintendent. But all his hard work still left him a relatively poor man. Things changed only when his wealthy boss and mentor lent him a tidy sum to invest in some promising stocks. Thus did Carnegie launch his career as a financier, eventually becoming a multimillionaire. He never again worked hard in the usual sense, preferring to concentrate on frequent and luxurious vacations, world tours, and extended stays in his native Scotland. Although there were more than 30,000 strikes between the Civil War and World War I, the textbooks Agnon studied give only a brief and usually negative mention of labor struggles and labor unions. Some of the books claim inaccurately that radical leaders were feared and hated by the public. Workers are never treated as belonging to a social class with common interests that are contrary to those of owners. Agnon concludes that these textbooks serve more as promoters of the existing corporate order than as independent sources of information. William Griffin and John Marciano studied how the Vietnam War was treated in 28 high school textbooks widely throughout the United States. They found that the books said almost nothing about the anti-colonial nature of the Vietnamese struggle, the ecological destruction and massive casualties caused by U.S. forces, the widespread torture and execution of prisoners, and other U.S. war crimes, including CIA-sponsored political assassination campaigns, Operation Phoenix. Nor did the texts mention the political, economic considerations behind U.S. interventionism, the significance of the anti-war movement at home, and U.S. government attempts to suppress it, and the unconstitutional exercise of power in waging such a war. The textbooks embraced the official justification for U.S. involvement in Indochina. The judgments they invited on the war invariably concerned tactics rather than purposes, through their pretensions of neutrality and suppression of crucial facts and alternate viewpoints. The textbooks fortify official renditions and of a benign, well-intentioned U.S. foreign policy, conclude Griffin and Marciano. After studying world history textbooks used in several high schools in New Jersey, Charlottesville Cates concludes that they lionize the United States and demonize socialist states and socialism in general. The class nature of history is completely denied. National liberation movements, especially those of Latin America, are derided as communistic and Soviet-aided, the assumptions being that anything linked to communism is evil. Imperialism, a dominant force in the world history, is afforded scant treatment. The two bitterly opposed social systems of fascism and communism are lumped together. Attempts by the Soviet Union to form a collective security pact against fascism during the 1930s, Moscow's support of anti-fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War, and the Soviet people's heroic contribution to World War II all go unmentioned. Cates also looked at U.S. history handbooks and found that the horrors of slavery are treated but not the underlying class of any labor. Underlying class exploitation of labor, or for that matter, the exploitation of any labor. The role played by communists during the Great Depression in the fight for industrial unionism, unemployed insurance, and public assistance go unnoticed. The struggle for African American rights is depicted as having been settled with the Civil Rights Act of the late 1950s. There are some wonderful teachers who take the time to depart from textbooks and teach a more revealing version of history, Cates writes, but many more need to be educated so they can present the other side and go further than the textbooks. And finally, the publishing of textbooks must be taken from the corporations. Indeed, textbooks are marketed by a publishing industry increasingly dominated by giant corporate conglomerates with combined annual textbook sales of $7 billion. The bulk of the textbook market is controlled only by 10 publishers. With concentration has come greater homogenization and standardization. Yeah, I got time. As a result, progressive teachers find it increasingly difficult to conclude more critically oriented materials in their course readings. Along with textbook history, we have at least one CD-ROM disc that provides hours of video clips and audio narration under the lofty title, The History of the United States for Young People. While no worse than many textbooks, the disc can be more insidious. A grisly image of human skulls appears on the screen as we are told of the North Vietnamese communists' advance into South Vietnam. The unproven association is clear, but the skulls quickly disappear when it is announced that President Nixon bombed communist bases in Cambodia with slick visuals and slanted text. The CD reassures its youthful audiences that Washington war makers during the Vietnam era were champions of peace and democracy. Unironically, writes Norman Solomon, quote, kids who use the glitzy history disc to learn about the war in Vietnam are encountering the same distortions that many of their parents and grandparents rejected 3 decades ago. The disc is marketed by the American Heritage magazine, owned by Forbes. Simon and Schuster, a subsidiary of the media grant Viacom, also had a hand in producing it. All right, one more section. The school as a tool. To say that schools fail to produce an informed, critically minded, democratic citizenry is to overlook the fact that schools were never intended for that purpose. Their mission is to turn our loyal su- their mission is to turn out loyal subjects who do not challenge the existing corporate dominated social order. That the school has pretty much fulfilled its system sustaining role is no accident. The educational system is both a purveyor of the dominant political culture and a product of it. Throughout their existence, schools and universities have been objects of concern to conservatives who seek to control what is taught. Consider what happens to one of the few progressive textbook series used during the 1930s, Man and His Changing World by Harold Rugg and his associates. The American Legion, the National Association of Manufacturers, and other such business and patriotic groups launched a concerted campaign to get Rugg's book removed from classrooms and libraries, charging that they were anti-business, anti-American, and socialistic. In fact, Rugg wrote virtually nothing about the industrial warfare of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but he did have a temerity to point out the markedly uneven distribution of national income. This was more than conservative groups could tolerate. Their campaign against Rugg's book proved successful enough to cause a drop in sales from nearly 300,000 copies in 1938 to a mere 20,000 by 1944. During the 1980s, when U.S. universities began revamping their Western civilization courses to allow for a more diverse and less Eurocentric approach, cries of alarm arose from conservatives who accused radicals, feminists, cultural elites, and ethnic minorities of trying to politicize scholarly subjects and devalue educational standards. Such critics failed to mention that Western civilization curriculum, which they sought to preserve as a sacrosanct cultural construct free of political correctness, multicultural diversity, was actually the progeny of government-sponsored propaganda courses initiated during World War I at Columbia University and hundreds of other institutions of higher jingoism, fashioned by white Christian gentlemen who use heavy doses of standardized Western history, politics, and philosophy. The War Issues course was designed, according to one of its directors, to instill male students who were soon to be inducted into the Army with an understanding fuck off, with an understanding of what war is about and the supreme importance to civilization of the cause for which we are fighting, unquote. During World War I, university officials across the nation attempted to impose ideologically correct views upon their faculty. Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, explicitly forbade faculty from criticizing the war, arguing that such heresy was no longer tolerable, for in times of war, the wrong-headedness was sedition and folly was treason. This was the same Butler who said that, quote, an educated proletariat is a constant source of disturbance and danger for any nation, unquote. At Columbia, one of the nation's leading historians, Charles Beard, was interrogated and, as he tells it, ordered to, quote, warn other men in my department against teachings likely to inculcate disrespect for American institutions, unquote. Beard described the trustees and Columbia President Butler as, quote, a reactionary and visionless in politics, narrow. Hold on, sorry guys. Yeah. Beard described the trustiness and Columbia's President Butler as, quote, reactionary and visionless in politics, narrow and medieval in religion, who sought to drive out or humiliate or terrorize every man who held progressive, liberal, or unconventional views on political matters, unquote. After World War I, many universities and colleges took the war issues course as the model for a new offering called Contemporary Civilization, which now is intended to immunize students from communism and other radical contaminants. The Hun was replaced by the Bolshevik as the great menace to democracy. During the Cold War years of the 50s and 60s, millions of U.S. school children were treated to regular infusion of My Weekly Reader and current events, neither of which alluded to the civil rights movement and was challenging and transforming race relations across the nation. Two publications projected a Manchian world. On one side, the Soviet Union, a totalitarian evil intent upon bringing the entire world under its heel, propelled by a dangerous aggrandizing ideology armed with weapons of mass destruction. On the other side, the United States, champion of human freedom, prosperity, peace, and national self determination, the purveyor of all that was virtuous and admirable. Sorry, guys. Um, Self determination, the purveyor of all that was virtuous and admirable among nations. 20 years later, the editor of My Weekly Reader did concede that, with the benefit of hindsight, they could see that their publication does not seem to have adhered to its platform of fair and unbiased reporting. But such a shortcoming, they claimed, merely reflected, quote, prevailing bias of the age, unquote. Today, right wing campaigns and attempts to get textbooks and curriculums to commit themselves to a totally celebratory view of American history, placing still greater emphasis on patriotism, the free market, family values, creationism, and other fundamental religious verities. Ugh. During a struggle in Kanawha County, West Virginia, that won national attention when it became violent, the county Board of Education uh, adopted guidelines demanding, among other things, that textbooks must encourage loyalty to the United States, and the several states shall teach the true history and heritage of the United States, and, quote, must not defame our nation's founders or misrepresent the ideals and cause for what they struggled and sacrificed, unquote. Strict adherence to such guidelines conceivably could prohibit future history books from giving a true account of the winning of the West, slavery, racism, Watergate, and other topics that might cause students to cast a critical eye upon our heritage. Controversies regarding grade school curricula percolate up to the national level. Beginning in 1992, the National Endowment for Humanities, the NEH, and the Department of Education enlisted a broad range of historical and teachings associations to put together a report on national history standards. National history standards that offered voluntary guidelines. Sorry for the pauses. Anyways, and illustrative material and lessons to help school districts upgrade their history curricula and improve student performance. The first draft of National Standard Projects, a volume entitled Lessons from History, was attacked by Lynn Cheney, a Bush-appointed NEH chairperson who initially had approved the project, perhaps for having slightly, quote, traditional history in favor of, quote, political correctness. This was followed by attacks from right-wing radio talk show hosts, a 99-1 condemnatory vote in the U.S. Senate, and much unsympathetic coverage in the major media. Far from ignoring the Constitution, as rightist critics charged, the report provides a whole section in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and numerous other constitutional references. Rather than publishing a politically correct line, it goes out of its way to accommodate, quote, different pedagogical and interpretive approaches, unquote. If the report had a serious defect, it was not its radical perspective, but its lack of radical perspective. It did attend to the subjects of racial oppression and gender discrimination, but its treatments of the realities of class power, labor struggles, and U.S. radical tradition were markedly inadequate. What bothers the conservatives, though they do not say it, is not the liberal historians are imposing their politically correct monopoly, but that they are departing in mild and tentative ways from the ongoing conservative ideological monopoly. Lessons from History was attacked not because it boosted the supposedly doctrinaire standard of leftists' cultural elites, but because it strayed occasionally from the doctrinaire standards of right-wing superpatriots. What really upset critics like Cheney was the report's unwillingness to devote itself exclusively to bolstering the kind of traditional history that rhapsodizes about national virtues and glories. Rightist campaigns against school curricula and textbooks are not unlike rightist attacks against the mainstream media. Schools and media both pretty much reflect a conservative conservative centrist view of the world. But such a view is not conservative enough for the rightists, who consider anything to the left of themselves as liberal and anything liberal as ideologically contaminated. Curriculum disputes, curriculum disputes, as with media disputes, are between the moderate center and the far right, with the entire critical left portion of the spectrum consigned to oblivion. Those who preside over our educational institutions generally are fully cognizant of their ideological responsibilities, though they may never describe them as ideological. Bored, uninformed students are a small price to pay in order to better secure cultural orthodoxy and political economic hegemony. Under such arrangements, real history is among the first causalities. And that's chapter 1. I think that's all for now. We will read the next chapter next week or at a later date. Just let me know when you guys would like me to go through that. Anyways, that's it. Peace. Until next time.